Hi everyone, my name's Rosa and I work with Richard on micromobility at the New Zealand Ministry of Transport. I've only been working in the transport sector for about a year and most of that time has been spent on micromobility, so I'm really excited to be here today and learn from all you. So last year I conducted a series of interviews with City Council staff and micromobility operators in New Zealand to understand their perspectives of the regulatory system for shared e-scooters. This presentation will cover how our regulatory system currently works in New Zealand and also cover some of the learnings from those conversations that I had last year. So there, as Richard mentioned, this is a bit of context for the situation in New Zealand at the moment. So there's been a significant increase in the number of electric micromobility devices in New Zealand since 2018. And different councils have been trialling the operations of these devices, predominantly e-scooters, through permitting commercial shared schemes. Initially, shared e-scooter schemes received a lot of bad press, and there are ongoing concerns regarding their cost to the health system. But despite a bumpy start, shared e-scooter schemes are now widely accepted as a permanent feature of New Zealand's transport system. And the map on the right here shows the different district councils that have shared e-scooter schemes and the approximate number of devices that operators are allowed to have on the streets in each city. We don't know how many privately owned electric micromobility devices there are in New Zealand, as these are not required to be registered with our transport agency. So this is an overview of some of the characteristics of our current regulatory system, and I'll just go into a bit more detail on each of these points. So firstly, bylaws are used as the primary lever for regulating shared e-scooter schemes, but are widely viewed as not fit for purpose. So most councils use a trading in public places bylaw to regulate rental e-scooter schemes. But despite being used widely, bylaws are not always viewed as an effective way to enforce local rules. Trading in public places bylaws are designed for regulating business activities rather than modes of transport. Many councils have to employ a range of bylaws to regulate rental e-scooter schemes, and in other cases, councils have had to rely on less formal arrangements such as memorandums of understanding. Councils do have the ability to review and adjust bylaws, including making new bylaws, but these are resource intensive and time consuming. From the perspective of most councils, bylaws do not constitute a regulatory framework for shared e-scooters. And in most cases, bylaws need to be augmented by codes of practice, primarily for nuisance and safety concerns. Councils have autonomy to set the regulatory and operating environments for e-scooter companies, which is seen as a really beneficial part of the system, but also quite a costly part of the system. So for operators, the system is challenging the business model of rental micromobility. Operators agree that while the system is functional, the inconsistencies in regulation across councils make compliance really costly. Inconsistencies in criteria for awarding permits and short-term licenses can make business planning difficult. Operators anticipate that requirements enforced by councils, such as no-go zones, may reduce rider utility and incentivise riders to opt for privately owned e-scooters, and this may reduce the ability of councils to influence rider behaviour. There is a view among operators that the commerciality of the business depends so much on the approach or reasonableness of individual officials and councillors. But for councils, the system enables them to ensure micromobility is working for their cities. The room for variance between council regulations enables them to design a bespoke regulatory environment for each jurisdiction, with differing urban form, infrastructure, appetite, and demand for micromobility as a transport solution. The locally led system enables each council to directly manage their relationships with the operators and have discretion over which companies can operate and under which conditions, for example, device caps, no-go zones, etc. The conditions placed on operators through the permits and licenses issued under bylaws can be updated without major resource. Councils need to be able to be reactive to their constituencies and short-term licenses make it easier to incorporate public feedback and lessons from other jurisdictions into codes of practice. Under the current system, there is no standardised approach for managing, monitoring and enforcing requirements across different councils or operators. So operators are responsible for ensuring their devices and riders comply with regulations. Some operators run in-person safety sessions, while others rely on rider engagement via the app interface to convey messages. All operators use software to enforce council rules, such as slow zones and no parking zones. Where council staff are responsible for monitoring compliance, managing issues of non-compliance can be costly for operators. Some councils are requiring that operators provide audits of their devices to ensure safety standards are met. Councils have different levels of resource and appetite to monitor and enforce regulations. Most councils rely on goodwill, trust, and mutual interest between them and operators for compliance with regulations, while other councils employ dedicated street trading inspectors to monitor compliance. Some smaller councils simply do not have the resources or capability to monitor and enforce the rules and regulations they set for operators. Under the existing system, if an operator was found to be in breach of regulations in one council, there is no mechanism to prevent them from operating in other regions other than information sharing between councils. If councils are not satisfied with the performance or compliance of an operator, they have relatively few regulatory tools available to manage issues. For many councils, the options are to either wait until the contract comes up for tender and not renew the permit, or to revoke the license. Resolving other issues can depend largely on relationships held between staff at the council and e-scooter company, rather than on established regulatory levers and practices. Overall, both councils and operators tend to agree that the regulatory system is functional, but not optimal, but disagree on how to improve it. Most councils express desire for more regulation from a central level, but for varying reasons. The bylaws used by most councils were designed to regulate business activities rather than transport modes, meaning they are not necessarily fit for purpose for micromobility. There is a view among some councils that if more regulation setting was elevated to central government, it could improve the use of evidence and data in policies. The lack of capacity and capability within some councils to enforce regulations and monitor their impact mean that suboptimal outcomes can persist and be detrimental to operators and the transport system. If devices were monitored and approved by a central government authority, it would provide safety assurance to operators, councils, and riders. Most operators did not want to see more regulation from central or local government. One of the major regulatory challenges for operators is the New Zealand Transport Agency Declaration, which classifies e-scooters as not motor vehicles, which Richard mentioned earlier. The declaration is viewed as out of date given the speed with which new devices are developed, and its definition is based on wattage, which is viewed as restrictive and limits the extent to which rental e-scooters can contend as an alternative mode of transport. While operators understandably did not want another layer of regulation from central government, they also value an existing regulation set locally becoming more consistent and conducive to integrating micromobility into the transport system. There is concern that councils rely heavily on each other to inform regulation setting. So if one council sets a regulatory environment that is difficult to operate in, it can quickly become common practice without direction and guidance from central government. This slide just shows the different players in the transport system in New Zealand as they relate to micromobility. So our policy and our delivery functions are separated between the ministry and the transport agency, with councils / local government bearing most of the burden for regulating e-scooters. So this is just some insights, some core insights from the interviews that I did last year. So there's currently limited evidence to suggest that there are significant safety issues arising as a result of the current system that would be addressed by having greater national oversight of operators. Most accidents to date have been attributed to rider error, although there have been cases of device safety features failing. However, e-scooters and other micromobility devices are constantly changing and becoming more sophisticated. If some of the more advanced features that have been proposed become a reality, there may be a greater case for national regulatory oversight. The overall sentiment from operators was that they understand and appreciate why councils need to be able to regulate certain aspects of their rental e-scooter schemes, but would like to see more data-driven decision-making and a more partnership style approach to regulation, monitoring and enforcement. However, in some regulatory environments, the requirements on operators are so burdensome that they are threatening the commercial viability of rental e-scooter schemes. Operators are finding that every iteration of council-issued codes of practice are tighter and places more burden on operators to comply with increasing rules and regulations. Operators question whether this trend is based on data and evidence to achieve better outcomes. Councils see value in central government regulating certain aspects of the system that are currently regulated by councils. For example, upper speed limits and helmet use, but with councils retaining the existing level of autonomy and flexibility within those centrally set rules. The extent to which councils would like the regulatory responsibility transferred to central government varies largely depending on each council's willingness and ability to effectively monitor and enforce the existing regulatory arrangements. Councils and operators have disparate experiences of the same regulatory system. One of the most fundamental points of difference is that all operators perceive rental e-scooters as a form of public transport, but are not subsidised, unlike other forms of public transport. Most councils, however, believe that they are indirectly subsidising e-scooter operators by not recovering all the costs of managing the permits, collecting and analysing data, and monitoring and enforcing the regulatory environment. However, no councils have been able to quantify this cost. So for our next steps in New Zealand, there are kind of two programs of work happening at the moment. The first is the Accessible Streets Regulatory Package, which our transport agency is progressing work on. I will just quickly caveat that we haven't been able to get anyone from the New Zealand Transport Agency onto this call today. So if there are more detailed questions about this regulatory package, I might have to get in touch with you after this and provide you an email address to someone at the Transport Agency. So the Accessible Streets Regulatory Package is designed to make footpaths, shared paths and cycle lanes safer and accommodate the increasing use of micromobility devices on streets and footpaths. Accessible Streets will create a national framework clarifying the types of devices and vehicles that are allowed on footpaths, shared paths and cycle lanes and how they can use these spaces. This will include a proposed 15km/h speed limit on the footpath and a requirement for all other footpath users to give way to pedestrians. The rules clarify how road controlling authorities, such as councils, may regulate pedestrians, devices, and spaces such as the footpath, and propose changes to remove barriers to walking, device use, and cycling. The interviews that I conducted highlight the importance of this regulatory package being progressed, because without it, existing issues in the regulatory system will be exacerbated. The other piece of work is that the Ministry of Transport, myself and Richard, are working with councils and the New Zealand Transport Agency to develop best practice guidance for the shared and rental micromobility sector. This work has just commenced this month and will cover best practice approaches to different micromobility policies, for example, curb space management, equity service, enforcement, and data standards. This work will also aim to establish an agreed definition of micromobility in New Zealand and set out its benefits and opportunities as a transport mode for the future. Thank you all for listening. We do have some industry and council representatives from New Zealand on the call, and I would just like to thank them again as well for participating in my research last year, which has greatly improved the Ministry's understanding of the regulatory system for e-scooters in New Zealand and has enabled me to give this presentation to you all. So thank you.